We're starting off this edition with the latest on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. The diplomatic attempts are intensifying with a mix of threats and brinkmanship adopted by Russia and the West. After France, it's time for the British diplomatic push. The latest meeting was between the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the NATO Secretary General. They have called the situation the most dangerous moment in European security. Listen in.
This is a dangerous moment for European security. The number of Russian forces is going up. The warning time for a possible attack is going down. NATO is not a threat to Russia, but we must be prepared for the worst, while remaining strongly committed to finding a political solution. The military adaptation sends a clear signal that Russia has a choice. They can either choose a diplomatic solution, and we are ready to sit down, but if they choose confrontation, they will pay a high price. There will be economic sanctions. There will be increased NATO military presence in the eastern part of the alliance.
Military analysts estimate that Moscow has amassed more than 100,000 troops on the borders of Ukraine. The Western leaders have confirmed that UK and NATO would not intervene militarily if Ukraine was attacked. But they repeated that Moscow would face unspecified economic sanctions. The British Prime Minister called on Vladimir Putin to de-escalate, stating that a conflict would be a disaster for both countries.
And when the Berlin Wall fell, the people of Europe made clear that they wanted their freedom and their security to be inextricably tied together. And that's why NATO agreed that any country should be free to pursue the security alliances that country chose. And we must resist, we must oppose any return to the days when the fates of nations are decided over their heads by a handful of great powers.
Let's go straight across now to our executive editor, Palki Sharma, who's with us on the broadcast from Kiev. Palki, UK and NATO reiterating that Moscow would face economic sanctions without elaborating and specifying on what those would be. What is your assessment of that meeting between the UK Prime Minister and the NATO chief?
Molly, I think the NATO allies and the Western allies of Ukraine are beginning to expose themselves for their absolute lack of strategy when dealing with this conflict. What are they depending on? They're basically, you listen to their statements and the gist of it is this: we hope for the best and we prepare for the worst. They're hoping that good sense will prevail and that Russia will come to its senses and pull back. That's not going to happen. They're hoping their sanctions threats are going to act as a deterrent. I want to know, when was the last time the threat of sanctions, or the imposition of sanctions for that matter, prevented any leader from going ahead and doing whatever they wanted to do? We've seen multiple examples, and Russia is still a much more powerful country. Sanctions have not even worked on North Korea or Iran for that matter. So it is expecting a bit too much to think that if you keep dangling this threat of sanctions, Russia is going to pull back. The third thing they're depending on is Ukraine offering unilateral concessions in implementing the Minsk Accord. Again, that's not something that Kiev wants to hear. That's not something that Kiev wants to do. And that statement comes almost on a daily basis from the government here in Ukraine, that while we remain committed to the terms, we are not going to implement it on Russia's conditions. So I frankly fail to understand what the strategy of NATO allies is at the moment, except for perhaps wait and watch as the Russians continue their build-up.
And at the same time, the fears of Europe's energy supplies facing further pressure are on the rise. Germany's economy minister has warned of the country's gas stocks falling to a worrying level, quote unquote. Russia seems to be using this as political leverage as well.
Absolutely, and Germany refuses to use the Nord Stream 2 as a leverage, as we've seen in the talks between Olaf Scholz and Joe Biden. they're not committing to pulling the plug on Nord Stream 2 in the event of a Russian invasion into Ukraine. So that very much remains on the cards, and this is a very tricky situation for both the leaders of Germany and France. France, because Emmanuel Macron faces an election in 2 months from now, and if he's able to hammer out some sort of a compromise, then he is a winner on all sides. But if an invasion does indeed happen, then France will have to step up and at least show that it remains committed to democracy and sovereignty of its partners, and that is going to have an impact on the economy. The gas prices, the bills are going to go up. Same for Germany. Olaf Scholz, remember, is new to office. He is not Angela Merkel, and he is going to have to prove himself. He's already been called the invisible chancellor, and he cannot take risks of the type that NATO allies expect Germany to take at this point. So it's a very tricky situation for the Europeans, and their best hope is that war does not happen. And to make that happen, I think they're trying to put a lot of pressure on Ukraine. We are seeing that the Normandy talks happening between the political foreign policy advisors of Ukraine, Russia, Germany and France. And their best hope is that some sort of a compromise is agreed to. But remember, the Minsk Accords are a failed ceasefire agreement.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.